He stepped onto the tracks ready to end it all, until his canine partner did something no one could believe. Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The platform seemed to blur as Sergeant Cole Matthews moved through the crowd like a man untouched by the world around him. His footsteps silent against the rhythmic pulse of hurried travelers lost in their own lives. The chatter, the laughter, the sharp announcements crackling through the overhead speakers. All of it faded beneath the thunderous weight of the decision he'd made before the sun had even risen that morning. His mind felt numb, his body heavier with every step closer to the edge. But his purpose had never felt clearer. This was it. The fight was over. No more restless nights tangled in memories that played on an endless loop. No more pretending he could drown out the echoes of a battlefield that never really let him leave. Ranger walked beside him, every muscle taut despite the calm in his stride, his dark eyes scanning the shifting faces and chaotic movement of the station. His instincts humming with a tension he couldn't explain but felt deep in the marrow of his bones. The leash hung loose between them, but it might as well have been a lifeline stretched thin, fraying with every tick of the clock as the train's distant whistle grew closer. Cole paused at the platform's edge, his battered boots inches from the warning line painted in faded yellow. The air tasted metallic, heavy with the scent of steel and oil, and for a brief, haunting moment, he closed his eyes and imagined the freedom that waited beyond that moment. Silence, peace, the end of a war that had followed him home and unpacked its bags in his chest. The whistle screamed again, louder this time, a final call that vibrated through the soles of his boots and rattled through his ribcage like the aftershock of an explosion. He took a slow, measured breath, the kind he'd learned to control before breaching a door or stepping onto hostile ground. But this time there was no enemy waiting, only the end. His foot lifted, the movement slow but certain, his mind a blur of faces and moments he couldn't quite hold on to anymore. Ranger's ears flattened, his body tensing as if some primal part of him understood before Cole even shifted his weight forward. And then, just as the train rounded the bend and the rails began to hum with its unstoppable approach, Cole's foot crossed the line, his body leaning toward the tracks and the inevitability waiting there. Time seemed to fracture, every second stretching into a painful eternity as the blinding lights of the train bore down on him, the roar of its passage drowning out the final desperate plea buried deep inside his heart. And in that suspended heartbeat, where life hung by a single thread of loyalty and fate, the world prepared to shatter or be saved. The midday sun blazed overhead like a merciless torch, turning the desert sand into a shimmering sea of heat and dust as the air pulsed with the crack and snap of gunfire. Sergeant Cole Matthews crouched low behind the fractured remains of a stone wall, sweat carving grimy trails down his dust-caked face, his breathing shallow, measured, every sense stretched razor-thin across the chaos. His hands clenched the grip of his rifle, knuckles white as he scanned the jagged horizon for any sign of movement, his mind running through tactical calculations even as the world threatened to collapse around him. Beside him, pressed so close he could feel the heat radiating through the thick fabric of his uniform, was Ranger, barely a year into service but already carrying the calm intensity of a seasoned soldier. His ears flattened against his skull, his chest rising and falling with steady control, and his eyes, God, those eyes, held a fire that refused to blink in the face of danger. They both knew what waited just beyond that broken wall. A kill zone lit with hostile intent. The enemy dug in, waiting for the smallest mistake. The radio crackled at Cole's shoulder, but he barely heard the words. His entire focus narrowed to the silent language shared between man and dog. One subtle glance, a tilt of Ranger's head, and Cole knew the enemy was closing in, moving through the alley 2 clicks west. It wasn't training anymore. This was survival, And in that crucible of life and death, something passed between them, something no amount of drills or protocol could ever create. Ranger wasn't a tool of war. He was a soldier in his own right, a partner who stood not just beside Cole, but with him in every heartbeat of fear, every pulse of bravery that kept them both alive. When the order came to push forward, Cole felt Ranger surge with him, his body a blur of muscle and precision as they moved through the crumbling ruins together. Bullets sliced the air, shattering stone and sending clouds of grit into their eyes. But neither faltered. Ranger darted ahead, his movements fluid and fearless, his training kicking in with surgical precision as he swept rooms and cleared corners faster than any human could. Cole trusted him completely, his own back protected by a creature who had no concept of fear, only duty. By the time the dust settled and the last shots faded into the searing silence of victory, they stood side by side amid the wreckage, their chests heaving in perfect unison, their eyes scanning the devastation with the haunted clarity of survivors who had seen too much and lived anyway. And from that moment on, nothing could separate them. In every mission after, every step through hostile terrain, Ranger was more than a partner. He was Cole's shadow, his protector when sleep became impossible, his anchor when the weight of command threatened to crush him. Together, they crossed the burning sands and the endless nights of uncertainty, bound by a loyalty that ran deeper than blood, forged in the fire of battles fought and survived together, and destined to carry them through even darker days yet to come. The cheering crowds had lined the streets that day, their voices raised high in celebration, flags waving and confetti falling like a snowstorm of gratitude. But as Cole rode through the parade, his uniform pressed and medals gleaming under the bright sun, he felt like an imposter wearing the skin of a man he no longer recognized. The faces blurred together, the applause rang hollow in his ears, and behind every proud smile he saw the ghosts of those who hadn't made it home, their memories etched into his mind with a clarity sharper than any blade. Ranger walked beside him through the fanfare, his head held high, his steps measured and precise, a soldier even in retirement. But those keen eyes flickered toward Cole again and again, as if sensing the turmoil hidden behind the practiced stoicism. When the parades faded and the streets emptied, when the medals were hung neatly on the wall and the uniform tucked away into the back of a closet that would never truly close on the memories it held, that's when the real battle began. The nights were the worst, when darkness settled in like a living thing, thick and suffocating, wrapping around his chest and tightening until every breath felt like a struggle. Sleep became a distant memory, a luxury reserved for those untouched by the relentless replay of firefights and final moments, of decisions that could never be undone. In those endless hours, the walls of his modest home felt too close, the air too still. Every creak of the floorboards a reminder that silence could be louder than any battlefield. And yet, through it all, Ranger was there. When the nightmares dragged him from restless half-sleep, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, Ranger was always the first to find him, the steady weight of his head pressing against Cole's trembling hand, those dark eyes meeting his with a calm that spoke volumes without a single word. When the restless pacing took over, when the need to escape the confines of his own mind pushed him out into the cold night air, Ranger walked beside him without question, their footsteps falling in time down empty streets as if they were still patrolling the outskirts of a war zone. Two soldiers standing guard against the invisible enemy of a past that refused to let go. But even loyalty as steadfast as Ranger's couldn't always pull Cole back from the edge. The weight grew heavier with each passing day, the fight to keep moving forward turning into a silent war fought behind tired eyes and forced smiles. And though Ranger remained his constant, a living reminder of the battles they had survived together, even the strongest bonds can fray under the relentless pressure of a soul too weary to believe in peace. And somewhere deep down, In the quiet moments when even Ranger's unwavering presence couldn't drown out the pull of the darkness, Cole wondered if the war had ever really ended at all. The dawn broke soft and pale, casting thin ribbons of light across the worn hardwood floors. The house so quiet it felt like it had already been abandoned. Cole sat at the small kitchen table, its surface scarred with years of coffee mug rings and cigarette burns, his hand shaking as he pressed the pen against the paper. The words came slowly, each one carved from a place of exhaustion too deep for explanation. I'm tired. I've fought as long as I could. Ranger deserves peace, and so do I. Please, look after him. The ink blurred where his fingers brushed the page, a testament to the war raging in his chest even as his mind begged for quiet. He set the pen down with a finality that felt heavier than any rifle he'd ever carried, the faint click of it against the table sounding louder than gunfire in the stillness. Rising slowly, he reached for Ranger's leash, his knuckles pale against the worn leather as he clipped it onto the metal ring at the dog's collar. Ranger sat patiently, his dark eyes tracking every movement with a quiet understanding, his ears twitching once as if catching some silent signal Cole couldn't hear. The door stood open, the cool morning air drifting in, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and distant lilacs blooming along the fence line. Cole paused in the threshold, his fingers brushing against the faded frame as if memorizing the feel of home one last time, his heart pounding with the weight of everything unsaid. Ranger pressed his head briefly against Cole's thigh, his body warm and solid, a final reminder that he was there, unwavering to the very end. And yet, in his stillness, there was a tension, a subtle resistance in the way his paws planted firmly on the floor, as if he sensed the heaviness of the road they were about to walk. Cole took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, each inhale scraping against the raw edges of his resolve. His boots moved forward, one leaden step after another as they crossed the porch and descended into the world beyond, the sun just beginning to rise above the rooftops, casting everything in a fragile golden glow that felt too beautiful for a day like this. With every block they passed, every corner turned, the familiar streets blurred into a haze of memories, the weight of his decision pressing down harder with every heartbeat. And still, Ranger walked at his side, loyal to the last mile, his head high and his eyes ever watchful, as if he was waiting for his moment to change the story written in the weary lines of his handler's face. And though Cole couldn't bring himself to look back, part of him knew, if anyone could pull him from the edge, it would be the one soul who had walked through every fire and never once let him fall. The crowd moved in a rush of indifference, the station alive with the noise of hurried steps, rolling suitcases, and voices layered over loudspeaker announcements. But to Cole, it all felt impossibly distant, like he was watching life unfold through thick glass he couldn't break through. His eyes never lifted from the tracks ahead, his mind a numb blur of memories crashing against the inevitable decision pulling him forward. Each step toward the platform's edge felt heavier than the last, the worn soles of his boots scuffing against the cold concrete, the world blurring into nothing more than light, sound, and the low hum of finality. Ranger walked beside him, but something in his gait had shifted. The easy grace replaced by a tension that coiled through his powerful frame like a live wire stretched too tight. His ears flicked back, his head tilted slightly as his eyes locked onto Cole's profile, reading every silent message written in the rigid line of his shoulders, the tightness of his jaw, the way his hand clenched and unclenched at his side. Ranger had been through enough battles to know when a man was preparing to fight, but he had also learned to recognize the far more dangerous silence of a man ready to surrender. The whistle of the oncoming train cut through the air, sharp and final, a warning that echoed off the station walls and seemed to vibrate through Cole's bones. The sound was a countdown, each blast pulling him closer to the edge, his boots crossing the faded yellow line that marked the boundary between hesitation and decision. Ranger's body went stone still, his front paws planting firmly as his entire being tensed. His eyes locked on Cole with a mixture of fear and defiance, his instincts screaming against the unspoken resignation radiating from the man he had trusted with his life. And then, just as the train's headlights pierced through the approaching tunnel, painting the platform in a blinding wash of light, Cole stepped forward. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't rushed. It was quiet, resigned, the simple act of a man too tired to keep holding on. But before his foot could find empty air, before his weight could shift toward that final fall, Ranger moved. It was a blur of motion, a flash of tan and black muscle as he lunged forward, his jaws locking onto the sleeve of Cole's jacket with a force that snapped the veteran out of his trance and sent him stumbling backward. The crowd gasped as Cole fell hard against the platform, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and blinking against the sudden onslaught of reality crashing back into him. And through the roaring thunder of the train speeding past just inches away, Cole felt the undeniable weight of Ranger's body against him, his deep, steady breaths, and the low, urgent whine rumbling from his throat. A sound that spoke louder than words ever could, a desperate whisper begging him to stay. The moment felt suspended in time, every sound stretched thin and every motion slowed as if the universe itself held its breath. Cole barely registered the sensation of his boot leaving the ground before a violent pull yanked him backward, his body whipping away from the edge with a force that snapped him out of the fog consuming his mind. The rush of air from the speeding train hit his face like a blast of heat and ice all at once, the deafening roar drowning out every thought but one. He was still alive. His back slammed against the unforgiving concrete, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs, his heart pounding against his ribs in a frantic, uneven rhythm. And then he felt it. Warmth pressed against his chest, the familiar weight of Ranger's powerful body pinning him to the ground, the dog's teeth still locked tight around his jacket sleeve, refusing to let go even as his entire frame shook from the sheer force of his leap. Cole's wide eyes found Ranger's, and in that instant, he saw everything he'd tried so hard to forget. The battles fought side by side, the nights in the desert when the only thing keeping him sane was the quiet companionship of a dog who never judged, never faltered, never left. Ranger's ears flattened against his head, his deep brown eyes filled with something raw and pleading, a silent cry that cut through every layer of darkness Cole had built around his heart. The train thundered by just inches from them, a blur of steel and sound that made the ground vibrate beneath them, the air thick with the scent of hot metal and the electric tension of lives hanging by a thread. Around them, the crowd stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief at what they had just witnessed. A man moments from stepping into oblivion, pulled back from the brink by the unwavering devotion of a creature who refused to let him fall. Cole's hands moved instinctively, his fingers curling into Ranger's thick fur, gripping it like the last anchor he had left in a world that felt so unbearably heavy. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, his mind struggling to piece together what had just happened, his heart aching under the crushing weight of emotions he'd buried for far too long. And as the final cars of the train disappeared into the distance and the platform fell into a stunned, reverent silence, Ranger finally released his grip, his massive head lowering to rest gently against Cole's shoulder, his entire body trembling with the aftershocks of what could have been. In that quiet aftermath, with the taste of despair still bitter in his mouth and the echo of a near end forever etched into his memory, Cole finally understood. Ranger hadn't just saved his life. He had reminded him, in the most desperate and beautiful way possible, that some battles are still worth fighting and some bonds are too powerful to ever be broken. The air on the platform felt thick with something unspoken, the kind of reverent silence that settles after witnessing a miracle. Time itself seemed to stand still as dozens of strangers stood rooted in place, their eyes locked on the scene before them, unable to tear themselves away from the raw, unfiltered emotion that unfolded like a living testament to loyalty and love. Ranger stood over Cole, his powerful frame braced and unmoving, his chest rising and falling with each hard-won breath, his ears pinned back, yet his stance proud and unyielding. His gaze never left Cole's pale, stunned face, his dark eyes filled with a silent storm of fear and a defiance that refused to accept defeat. In that moment, he wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier still standing guard over his brother in arms, a protector who had crossed the line between instinct and something far deeper, something almost human in its clarity. Cole lay beneath him, his chest heaving, his lungs burning with every shallow breath, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Shock, guilt, gratitude, and a rising tide of something unfamiliar but undeniable. Hope. His hands shook as he reached up, fingers tangling into Ranger's thick fur, grounding himself in the steady warmth of the only constant he had left in a life that felt like it had fallen apart long ago. Around them, the crowd seemed to come alive in soft waves, hushed voices sharing the story, even before the words fully formed, their faces reflecting the gravity of what they had witnessed. Some stood with hands pressed over their hearts, their eyes glassy with unshed tears, while others fumbled for their phones, not to capture a tragedy, but to immortalize a moment where courage and love conquered despair. Children clung to their parents, their wide eyes full of wonder at the sight of a hero who didn't wear a cape but bore a collar and a soldier's. Heart. The station, a place normally consumed by hurried footsteps and impatient glances, had become a sanctuary of understanding, a shared space where every person present would carry the memory of that moment for the rest of their lives. And as the last echoes of the train's passing faded into the distance, a single voice broke through the stillness, trembling but clear, a young woman near the front of the crowd whispering, "That dog just saved his life." Those simple words rippled outward, a confirmation of what everyone already knew but couldn't quite say aloud. And in that shared realization, something shifted. People didn't just witness a life saved. They witnessed the kind of loyalty that transcends understanding, a bond forged in battles most would never comprehend, a living testament to the power of love when all hope seems lost. And as Cole struggled to sit up, Ranger leaned his weight gently against him, his body warm and solid, his silent message as clear as if he had spoken the words himself. "You're still here, and I'm not going anywhere." The cold beneath him seeped through every layer of clothing, but it couldn't numb the firestorm erupting in his chest, the unbearable pressure finally breaking apart under the crushing weight of everything he had locked away. Cole felt Ranger's body pressed close, the steady rhythm of his breathing warm against his cheek, the subtle tremor in the dog's massive chest betraying the strain of holding the world together for a man too lost to see how much he still mattered. And in that fragile, suspended moment between ruin and redemption, Cole couldn't look away from Ranger's eyes, those deep, dark eyes that had stared down the barrel of war and now stared directly into his soul, demanding nothing and yet begging for everything all at once. His defenses shattered like glass under a hammer, the walls he'd built to keep the pain out collapsing into a flood that wouldn't be held back any longer. The sob ripped from his throat before he could stop it, raw and broken, a sound that felt like it had been trapped behind his ribs for years. His hands curled into Ranger's thick fur, clutching him like a lifeline, his shoulders shaking as the grief poured out unchecked. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the tears weren't born from weakness or failure. They came from something deeper, a fragile, almost unrecognizable spark that flickered faintly in the darkness. Hope. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he believed. Maybe the battles he thought were over hadn't been fought in vain. And maybe, just maybe, There was a road back from this place, one paved with the steady presence of the only soul who had never once given up on him. Ranger didn't move, didn't pull away. He leaned in closer, resting his massive head against Cole's shoulder, his breath calm and steady, his presence a silent promise that no matter how deep the darkness got, he would stand his post and wait for his friend to find the strength to rise again. Around them, the world slowly returned to motion, the hush of the crowd giving way to quiet murmurs and reverent glances. But Cole heard none of it. For him, there was only the sound of Ranger's breathing and the quiet, tentative voice inside that dared to whisper that this wasn't the end. It was the moment everything changed. When his sobs finally eased into exhausted silence, Cole pressed his forehead against Ranger's and drew in a slow, ragged breath. His voice cracked when he finally spoke, barely more than a whisper against the weight of the morning air. "I'm still here," he said, as much to himself as to the dog who had saved him. And in that declaration, quiet and broken but alive, the first light of dawn pushed back the shadows that had held him captive for far too long. The days that followed unfolded like the slow bloom of a flower struggling through frost, fragile yet undeniable, each morning a little brighter than the last. The story of what happened on that train platform spread faster than Cole could have imagined. A ripple that turned into a wave as headlines flashed across screens and social media feeds lit up with the image of a man on his knees and a dog standing guard over him. A living testament to the kind of loyalty most people only read about in stories. Letters and emails poured in, some from old comrades who hadn't heard his name in years, others from perfect strangers who confessed that they too had once stood on that same ledge, teetering on the brink until someone pulled them back. Each message felt like a thread pulling him closer to the surface, stitching together the frayed edges of a life he'd nearly given up on. And through it all, Ranger was there, the constant silent force at his side, a beacon of calm amid the storm. Together, they began walking a new path, not just for healing, but for purpose. What started as quiet meetings in small community centers grew into packed rooms filled with faces marked by familiar pain. Men and women who wore their invisible wounds as heavily as Cole once had. And when words failed, as they often did, Ranger would walk through the crowd, resting his head gently on a trembling knee, or pressing his warm body against someone lost in the fog of their own silent battle. There was a magic in his presence, a wordless reminder that no one had to fight alone, and it broke through barriers that years of therapy never could. Cole shared his story, not to relive the darkness, but to show the way through it. He stood before them, not as a man who had all the answers, but as someone who had been to the edge and survived, who knew the weight of despair but also the strength it took to step back and try again. And every time the room grew heavy with emotion, every time the silence became too much to bear, Ranger would step forward, his calm gaze sweeping across the crowd as if to say, "Look, we're still standing." Slowly, hope took root where despair had once flourished. Veterans who had stopped believing in tomorrow began to show up again. Their shoulders a little straighter, their eyes a little clearer. Strangers became allies, and healing didn't feel like an impossible mission anymore. And in the quiet moments after each gathering, when the chair sat empty and the lights dimmed low, Cole would sit beside Ranger, his hand resting on the dog's broad back, his heart lighter than it had been in years. In those still hours, with the echoes of lives touched and saved lingering in the air, Cole understood that this was the mission that mattered most. Not one fought with weapons or tactics, but with compassion, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog who had already saved the most important life of all. The morning sun broke through a veil of silver clouds, casting soft beams of light over the station platform where the echoes of that life-altering day still seemed to linger in the cracks of the concrete and the faded yellow line near the edge. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faint scent of spring blossoms and the quiet murmurs of the gathered crowd. Veterans in crisp uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians. Families held children close, and cameras flashed without disturbing the sacred hush that had settled like a prayer over the place where a life had been saved and countless others had been forever changed. Cole stood tall at the center of it all, his posture no longer burdened by invisible weight, but lifted by a sense of purpose he'd once thought lost to the darkness. Beside him, Ranger stood proud and still, his coat gleaming in the soft light, the metal resting against his chest catching the sun and scattering tiny bursts of gold across the platform. His eyes held the calm wisdom of a soldier who had already faced the worst and refused to break, a silent sentinel standing in full awareness of the honor bestowed upon him. The plaque was unveiled with quiet reverence, the simple inscription carved into polished stone as timeless as the bond it honored. For the courage that saved a life and the loyalty that changed countless more. A single trumpet sounded, its mournful, beautiful notes carrying through the open air, and then came the final salute, a sharp, unified crack of hands raised to brows, a gesture that seemed to cut through the last remnants of sorrow and lay them to rest. As the sound echoed across the platform and drifted skyward, Ranger did something that made every heart in the crowd tighten with emotion. He stood straighter, his head lifted high and in motion. Slow and deliberate, he raised his right paw and held it toward the horizon, pointing toward the distance as the rumble of a passing train began to build. The train emerged from the bend, not as a symbol of an ending, but as a living testament to life moving forward. Its cars were filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Windows opened to the fresh air, faces turned toward the day ahead, and for the first time, that sound filled Cole's heart not with dread, but with peace. He felt Ranger press gently against his leg, a soft reminder that they had made it, that through every shadow and storm they had found their way back to the light together. And as the train roared past, its powerful wheels singing against the tracks, Cole looked toward the horizon and finally understood the message Ranger had spent every day of the past year teaching him. That even when we stand at the very edge of despair, love and loyalty have the power to pull us back, to keep us standing, and to lead us toward a tomorrow filled not with fear, but with hope.